I think this is going to be a fun one. Well, it might not be fun for all of you watching as I pick apart your manuscripts, but that's what we're going to do today. I asked for my viewers to send in their first 500 words, if they dared, for me to critique and line edit. And I got a lot of entries. I didn't really know how this would go. I ended up doing 10 critiques, and 5 of them, I think, went to Patreons. So I got about 60 entries in total. So if you're not a Patreon, your chances of being in this video are about 1 in 10. But clearly it was very popular. Hopefully this won't be the last time and you'll all get another chance. If you're new to this channel, let me just introduce myself very quickly. My name is Lydia Foxglove. I've been a professional novelist since 2009 when I sold my first young adult novel. I've had 5 traditionally published young adult fantasy novels with Bloomsbury and Hyperion, and then I moved into self-publishing. Self-published, I published almost 50 books, made hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, over a period of time. It's not as impressive as it sounds. Long story short, that's my resume. Before I give advice, you can take it or leave it. And in fact, I always say, no matter who is giving a critique, the critique always has to feel right to you. And I also feel as a writer that the most important thing to do when you're early on is to develop your own voice and vision and find out what you really love to write, what your personal style is. There will be times when a critique just doesn't feel right to you, and the more you know yourself first, the better. So I'm gonna go through these 10 first pages. Usually a week like this would just be completely exhausting. But one thing I definitely noticed this week is that I continued to have an easier time switching my focus between multiple different tasks in a day, and I have been doing a lot of different tasks in a day. But I must say, ever since I started taking this magic little potion, I have been moving between tasks with ease. If you'd like to give Magic Mind a try for yourself and see what it does for your focus, you can use my code CozyCreative20. There's a link in the description and you can try it risk-free. Also, everyone in here is going to be anonymous. I'm not revealing who anyone is. A couple people were concerned about that. Don't worry, I should have said that up front. I'm not going to say your name or who you are. And also in the comments, you know, everyone who submitted their pages is being very courageous. If you have any advice to give them, just please be nice and constructive, and remember that some of them sounded extremely nervous, some of them are very beginner, some of them are not native English speakers, so just bear all that in mind and hopefully, you know, keep it positive. But one thing that I did want to bring up that's fairly universal to many first pages. Some of this will be personal taste. A lot of it is that you can tell in a first page when an author has command of the elements of a story. When you're new, you might think, how can anyone tell whether my book is good from the first page? Like, it's about to get good if you just like are patient and wait till page 3 or whatever, but you really can tell a lot from a first page. That number one thing is just whether the author is going to properly juggle all the balls, which is really not easy. And possibly the most important one of all is to give it something that just stands out, that makes you want to keep reading. One bit of advice I've often heard for first pages is that there should be something tense, something that grabs you from the first page. And that often leads to people starting the book with a bunch of action. This was kind of a backlash to a more slower paced book that often started with a character introduction. There's kind of a notorious cliche of the character looking in the mirror so that you know who they are. And in response to that, people started opening books with the middle of a war, a murder, you know, something crazy happening. Some books that does fit, and there's some books that fit having a character description early on. There can be all kinds of openings that work. So with those opening statements said, let me get to the pages. And this video is a bit experimental. We'll see how this format works, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the page and then I'm going to line edit the page on screen so that you can see what I'm doing. Sample 1. The most prominent feedback I have with this sample is that the first paragraph really throws a lot at you. I was a little disoriented in the beginning and I felt like they could have had a little more clarity, so I'm going to dig into that and kind of show you what I might do. There is usually more than one way to fix a problem, so this does not necessarily mean the author should fix it the same way that I did, but these are just examples of how would I line edit, what would my thought process be. Okay, so this book opens with a paragraph that really throws a lot at you as far as like names. The march of Kotim's guards was the thundering of angry gods. The tears dripping from the tip of his perfect nose were an insult to all the 8 kingdoms. So when the first sentence started, I thought that Kotim was a place, and so then when it said the tears dripping from the tip of his nose, that kind of, I had to recalibrate. I would probably change this to the march of Prince Kotim's guards, because in a bit we find out that he's the prince. That would clarify that. Then these first 2 sentences, they kind of have the same rhythm. I would like to see a little bit more variance in these sentences because it would just give it a little bit of a better rhythm. But I'm not really sure what this sentence is getting at. Like, tears don't usually drip from a nose. It sounds like sweat is more what's meant, but by saying tears, first I'm thinking he's crying, then I'm thinking that maybe he's crying so much that it's even coming out over his nose. But then as the passage continues, I start thinking that what you really mean is sweat. So I would generally probably just play with that a bit, or maybe even cut it. As his men guided him through the cramped streets of Hyrule, did Hannibik really call this their capital city? Past a shrieking woman in patched robes, he caught an upsetting whiff of rotting discards. So right up front, you had Kotim, that I wasn't sure whether it was a person or a place. Then you have the 8 kingdoms, Hyrule, Hannibik. There's just a lot of things that are just slightly like, oh, what is that for an opening paragraph? So let me see what it looks like if I just cut this sentence for now. And then I also kind of want to cut this because I just kind of want to get more to the punch. And I feel like we get a lot of like, women are shrieking, discards are rotting, the streets are cramped. I think we have enough to get the vision for now. So now we've got this, and if the shrieking woman has a point on page 2 and I just cut her cruelly, then you can ignore that. So paragraph 2 I feel like is pretty solid. Paragraph 3, he knocks on the door and it's answered by a swirling multicolored mass of goo. That is not what I expected based on the high fantasy opening, so that's kind of fun. It makes you wonder, oh, okay, what kind of world is this exactly? I'd probably correct this a little to 3 somber knocks, each a reminder of the fading heartbeat within, before a swirling multicolored mass of goo answered the door. That just clarifies the timeline of the actions. Eyeballs on slimy purple stems emerged from the mass and locked onto Kotim, identifying him as the object of the small army filling the street. Object strikes me as a bit of an odd word here. I would probably swap that for leader. But I'm also not, I'm actually not even sure that we need this. Like, we know he's the leader of the army already. Now, in this paragraph, we get a bit of humor. Kotim is trying to be polite, albeit a bit arrogantly, to this being, and is having to guess what gender they are and makes the wrong move. I'm leaving the rest of the page on the screen for a minute so that you can read it if you want, but I didn't really have a whole lot to correct for the rest of the page. It mainly was the first paragraph that kind of had me hung up, and after that, I feel like I am kind of curious to know where this is going, what kind of world this is that is giving me high fantasy vibes, but also has creatures made out of goo, why he's looking for the princess. There's a bit of humor, and generally this has been pretty fun. Sample 2. With this one, the main thing that I noticed is that there are a lot of excess words being used to get to the point. This is very common. There's just a lot of things where I feel like it could be tightened to keep the pacing moving briskly in these crucial early paragraphs. So I'm going to show you how I would do that. I tried to put myself in the screen so that you could see my face, but the way that the lighting is right now, it just shows up as like a big sun halo and my dark face. And my curtains fell down, like the entire structure that holds up curtains just collapsed off the wall recently. So anyway, let me get to this next selection. The actual writing is pretty good, fairly active, has some good description, but it's just using a lot of words that are often kind of repeating similar concepts. So just bear with me here while I show you what I would do to trim it down. Okay, she reached for the remote and muted the television. She muted the television. Our brains can fill in the remote. Similarly, we can fill in that she stood to keep everything grammatically correct. She muted the television and walked to the screen door, holding her breath. It was definitely arguing, like, this is kind of a lot. Maybe something more like, the argument rang out like the call and response of barking dogs. Something along those lines. But she couldn't make out what they were saying. We could just say any words. She scanned the backyards of her neighbors. We'll just leave it there. But saw no one outside. I mean, there's only so many directions you can look to see the yards of your neighbors. You're pretty much going to go left, right. It was coming from some distance, she supposed. Their voices carry, I don't think that we need all that. Birdsong and the soft rush of cars speeding down the busy street only 2 blocks away. We could probably just say something like the main road. That would kind of give the vibe that maybe the road isn't right out her window, but there's like a road making noise a short distance away. Still a little long, but it does tighten it up quite a bit. Then similarly, she looked down at her grass-stained shoes and considered putting them on to have a look at the vegetable garden, which was near the back fence. Just as she was about to slip them on, like this is kind of too much about the shoes, right? So we could just say she was about to slip on. She's about to slip on her grass-stained shoes. Maybe we could say something like to feign a look at, I don't know if that's like the best word there, but that's the word that came to mind. Like she's pretending to look at her garden, right? So that she can be nosy. To feign a look at the vegetable garden, we can probably gather that the garden is near where she's trying to see, so I don't think we need to specify that it's near the back fence. Just as she was about to slip them on, we could cut that, because I already moved that. The raw, visceral sound of a chainsaw blasting to life cut through the air and cut off their voices, sending her pulse racing. I almost feel like the raw, visceral sound of a chainsaw cut off their voices. I kind of feel like you could just quicken that because you're going to guess that the chainsaw started up. Like a chainsaw isn't just going out of nowhere. The reader can fill in some of these details. We need to fix that. Actually, you know what I'd like to do? When a raw, visceral sound sent her pulse racing. A chainsaw. Their voices cut off abruptly. And I'd just make that its own paragraph. Then it has this impact of like, uh-oh. A flush crept up her neck and face, and she could feel her pulse pounding. I think that's kind of enough of a reaction. We feel it. And we know she can't see anything because otherwise we would have seen it with her. Let's see, maybe like, instead of that, her ears strained, she didn't hear a scream. Dark images flashed through her mind, but were just as quickly wiped away with a reasonable inner declaration that no one would be that stupid. Murder, even a murder of passion, doesn't happen on a sunny afternoon for all the neighborhood to hear. Fair enough. This is probably a pretty reasonable reaction to hearing people arguing and then a chainsaw and then thinking, but I'm in my cozy little neighborhood. But I would probably cut all this because I think we kind of get that already. Actually, I'm going to put that back in. No one would be that stupid. Murder, even a murder of passion. Okay. Then we get to the next paragraph, which basically just tells Clara's personality traits, but I feel like we don't need this right now. I think that all of this, that Clara is curious. I understand the urge to describe the character right here, but frankly, we're in the middle of the action, and I'd like to keep us in the action because we're already getting a sense of Clara's curiosity, and you don't yet need to sink deeper into her. In some books you might, but in this case, I think this is a little too raw. Okay, the high-pitched whine of the chainsaw as it buzzed through a solid, heavy object seemed to indicate that whoever was wielding it probably had a dead tree on their property. There were many dead trees in the neighborhood, ash borers having decimated most of the old-growth trees in the last decade. Trees that used to provide lush emerald green shade in the summer now that's a tense change, now stood starkly naked, their limbs cracking and stabbing the ground like spears when the wind picks up. Now, if you're going to step out of the action, this does work for me personally because it's kind of adding to the atmosphere. It feels ominous, like the trees are somewhat reflecting Clara's mental state already. The safety of the neighborhood is gone along with the trees, and in this moment, that's how she's viewing the neighborhood, is how I'm seeing it, and that does work for me much more powerfully than the last paragraph. Now this paragraph, I was a little confused. There's a tense change, and I'm not sure if this means that this chainsaw incident is a flashback. I don't think so, because this is still Clara. We're just kind of explaining Clara's traits again. I'm not sure where page 2 is going, so I'm not sure how I would fix this exactly, but that paragraph just doesn't feel right to me generally. So with some tightening, there's some pretty effective stuff going on, but I would advise any of you with the temptation to step out of ominous action to suddenly just kind of calmly explain your character's traits in a way that's told and not shown. There are times when that could work, but generally I would not recommend it. Now with sample 3, I felt like the writing was pretty solid. I have a few line edits I'm going to show you, but generally I didn't have a ton to fix. The main thing I felt that this first page was missing was some kind of hook. And again, this does not have to be something crazy, but there just wasn't that one little element of, oh, this is different, or how's that gonna pan out? I find that readers are a lot more forgiving than agents and editors. So it does depend to a certain extent on what your goals are, how brutal you need to be with your first pages. If this author's intent is to self-publish, this page might be fine just as it is. So I just have some little tweaks here, just to tighten it up a little bit. The red-headed girl hunched into her hiding spot by the marketplace, shoulder blades poking out like the wings of a damaged sparrow. Seagulls cried their hunger above her, waiting for the same thing she was, for the old unsellable goods to be dumped so she could eat without punishment. You've got this for the doubled up here, and I would try to avoid that, so I would probably say, like, awaiting the same thing she was. You could also do the dumping of the old unsellable goods, but that sounds a little clunky to me. She could smell the salty, briny scent of the raw fish. That's kind of a weak construction, so I would just do the salty, briny scent of the raw fish made her stomach cramp painfully. Then here she knew roughly where each gang's territory started and ended, having run afoul of many of them many times. Again, I would try to avoid the many, double construction there, running afoul of them many times, and now had a mental map in her head of the very few safe areas she had carved out that afforded her enough time to eat or sleep in relative peace. You could probably just cut very, because, you know, you kind of already got the point with that. Distracted by a particularly vicious gurgle from her stomach, she did not hear the footsteps behind her. I would not do she did not hear the footsteps behind her. I would stick in her point of view, because that's getting into more of like the narrator is actually like your, what is that called? Oh my god, why can't I remember what this is called? Like when you have the author actually having a point of view. I have done it before, and people always are like, that's old-fashioned, but I actually really like when the author has a point of view. Like Ellen Montgomery books often do that, but I don't think that's what you're going for here. The like, dear reader, she did not hear the footsteps behind her. Plus, we kind of know she doesn't hear the guy, because as soon as he talks, she jumps and whips around, which is not the reaction you have to someone that you heard. Also, if anybody doesn't know this single, this is common in the UK and perhaps in Europe too. I don't know how many countries, but I know that sometimes UK authors get harassed for having different punctuation conventions than Americans, so I just want to note that that is perfectly valid. If you are an American, hold your comments. Okay, so my next comment here. In truth, Bethy didn't really know what her name was. She didn't know if it was short for Elizabeth or if it was actually Bessie, and her youthful tongue, which still sometimes caught on a lisp, had mispronounced it. But that was what had come to her when asked by the women at the orphanage. I would probably try to tighten this up a little, because you've got she didn't really know, she didn't know. You could do something like Was it short for Elizabeth, or was it actually Bessie and her youthful tongue, which sometimes still sometimes caught in a lisp, had mispronounced it? You know, you can kind of have her thought with a question, and that allows you to trim some of it. And I would also cut this in answer to his question, because that's already clear. Generally, I don't have a whole lot of line edits for this. I really just kind of want to see a little more intrigue, that one little tidbit that makes you go, where's that going? But if the blurb for the book was really good and already kind of hinted at that, it might not matter very much. It has pretty good details as far as like the setting. You can smell the fish and the sea air, crates and the fishermen. You know, you got a good like video game setting here, I think. Like I played this board. Sample 4, this one definitely has the intriguing elements that I would want to see to keep me reading. But the way that it's introduced is a little disorienting, and sometimes that's okay. I do have a fairly low tolerance for being disoriented, so bear that in mind. But I wanted to see just like a little more clarity. Okay, like this one has some really cool visceral imagery. I notice that I'm dying when my fingernails start to decay. Like, ugh. I stop mid-dance, but the ritual is complete, and the rest of the macabre suffering hits a second later. The leathering of skin, the trembling of a heart too weak to beat, the drying of sanguine life. It was a vulnerable moment for me, writhing on the floor. A truly terrible time for my amulet to heat, its warmth a whisper of warning at the approach of my infamous malefactor. This last sentence is where I start to get a little like, wow, that's a lot of words to take in. And you have a lot of truly terrible time, warmth, a whisper of warning, and then the approach of my infamous malefactor. Like, what you're saying is that she's doing a ritual, and in the meantime, she wears this amulet that heats up to warn her that this stalker is near. Like, it took me a minute to puzzle out what this sentence means. Let me play with it a minute. Maybe I just want this to be a little cut up a little bit more. It's warmth, it's sudden warmth, whispers a warning. Then almost something like he's here, rather than like that. I don't know if it fits the voice of what you want to do here. But if you did something like that, it gets the point across a little clearer to me, and it feels a little more ominous. Like when you have something that's going on that's really like, bam, oh shit. You kind of want the punch of a short sentence suddenly, because you have this beautiful language here for this ritual and this death, which is more of a, I don't know if slow and poetic is the way you would describe a dance of death, the dance macabre, I guess. But anyway, something like that might get the point across a little better for me. However, generally, I don't have a whole lot of line edits for this bit. I am intrigued. I'm going to scroll down so that everyone else can, if you want to hit pause and see what the rest of this page was. This first page definitely delivers as far as giving me something that feels both like familiar fantasy material and also something a little surprising, that I haven't quite seen anything like this scene before. And that's a good sweet spot to nail. There's this hint of someone pursuing them. Why are they doing this ritual? It's all pretty intriguing, and there's some very good writing here. Now, this sample also just has, to me, too many words to get to the point in the early paragraphs. I don't really have a sense of where it's going, which I know can sound a little much for the first page. But ideally, where your book is going should be like a beacon light that is shining through the entire book. From the very first page, there should be some tiny hint of where the story is going. It's not always easy to explain what that looks like. However, if it was tightened up, there probably would be whatever happens on page 2 would bump up to page 1. So that might fix it, because I don't know what happens on page 2. Okay, so this is another one where I'm going to cut a lot of stuff, so I'm sorry. I always feel bad when I just get in here and tear things up, but that's what the video is about. My fist slams the hood of the hover car as it stops. Horns echo off the surrounding buildings as the cars behind it swerve to avoid causing a collision in the intersection. Beeps continue down the congested roads as people protest even the slightest delay. Everyone's always in a rush in the city of Best. Like, I think you could, horns. You know what? I almost feel like you don't even need any of that. That's kind of my feeling. My fist slams the hood of the hover car as it stops. Red light, I scream. To me, that just has a lot more like, bam. Okay, here's maybe where I would put horns echo all down the congested roads, bringing something back in from that previous paragraph. I'm just going to cut that. I don't think you need the scream. I can feel the irritation in this voice. Just wait a sec, please. I put one hand up so the driver doesn't lose sight of me. Sure enough, my hoverboard's beneath the car. Just going to cut that because that's already pretty clear. And you know, we don't really need to know exactly where it is. Well, we can fill in these details as readers. And then I'd probably cut that too, because you can feel the reach just with I crawl underneath and I'm just able to grab it as the hover car pulls forward and up. And then in this sentence, you've got the as the twice. You don't really want a sentence that goes as the blank. That just kind of reads as being awkward. As the hover tech pushes me into the ground. I'd probably just trim that. The car takes off down the street. Or you know what? Even just the car glides off down the street. And then you could, I would probably put in a reaction here like, damn. This has a little more punch, a little more of this character's emotion. Now, I'm not really sure where this is going, like I said in the beginning. So I'm just kind of guessing based on what I have that this is all going to be important or say something important about this character. As the other cars rush forward, I spring upward, board in hand, heading for the sidewalk. Another horn blares, and with one last long stride, I jump towards the sidewalk. My foot just makes the curve, but it's not enough. My foot slips and I stumble forward. My arms spin like discs as I try to right myself. I'm about to fall when my left hand grabs hold of something and I manage to steady myself. We have like 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences devoted to just making a hop onto a sidewalk, which is a very quick action, so I would just cut this down to like 1 sentence or like 2. Like maybe just my foot catches the curb because obviously you do need something to join, so maybe 3. I jump toward the sidewalk, my foot catches the curb. I'm about to fall when my left hand grabs hold of something. There's a few little line edits I could nitpick in here, but I feel like I kind of got the point across with this one already. I already tore up the first few paragraphs pretty good, so I'm not gonna poke at the rest. I don't feel like the rest needs as much line editing. Mainly, I just want a little more sense of where this is going. I do have to point out that I really like this line, my throat goes from a tunnel to a pinhole as I suck in a thread of air to speak. It's really hard to come up with a somewhat unique sentence for a very universal feeling, like fear or anxiety, and that feels fairly fresh, so kudos for that one. But yeah, this is one where I have a feeling I probably need a page 2 to give a better idea of what could be improved here, because I definitely feel like it's leading up to something and it just hasn't quite gotten there yet, but I would want to see it slightly sooner. This one looks to be a lit RPG, and that's pretty much a totally self-published genre. So writing-wise, it doesn't need to be up to the standard of, the Pulitzer Prize or the Man Booker Prize or I feel like generally this works for a lit RPG, and I hate to say something like that because it makes it sound like, oh, that genre, the writing can just be crap, and that's not really what I mean. There's kind of different kinds of good writing. Some of them, the actual prose is a bit workmanlike, but the ride you're going to take, whether it's a lit RPG or like, a steamy romance, it's a little more about like having fun with this concept. I won't be offended if you correct me on that and tell me that actually there's some very literary lit RPGs out there. So this one I do feel like I haven't read a lot of lit RPG, but they do always kind of seem to start in a way similar to this, so I think this probably fulfills the genre conventions in both prose style and sequence of events. So I don't have a whole lot to critique about it. One thing I did want to note is that there was a lot of adjective noun construction in the beginning. Blistering heat, musty smell, crisp bright turn, cheerful green. This is the kind of super nitpicky thing that if I was doing line edits, it would bother me that you have that same basic adjective noun construction so many times close together, and I would probably change something. Like, it could be just as simple as on his dash the routing app glowed cheerfully, or even glowed cheerfully green. I would just do something to break it up a little. Again, this is very nitpicky, but when I do line edits, I am extremely nitpicky. If I'm also being very nitpicky, you could probably trim this a little and just say the student continued blithely onward or something like that, or obliviously onward. Just like here, I might just cut that back, stew it just enough time to look back in the side mirror, because you know what you're going to be looking at in the side mirror. And the cheap frayed seat belt separated, releasing. Separate and release, pretty similar, so you could just say it's separated. And then in a few of these, I've harped on not having similar sentence construction too close together, but sometimes you do want that. You want it for a certain kind of impact. And here is a case where this is used in a way that works. Momentum carried Stu through the windshield. Shock carried him through the traumatic loss of important body parts and fluids. There's a deliberate usage that has a nice little oomph to it. That is the end of this page, and, generally I think it works, but I'm not an expert on lit RPG. And then the next one, this one definitely has intriguing elements. I mainly feel like this one has a few things with pacing that could be improved, as well as there's certain moments where I feel like a connection isn't being made quite as well as it could, and that some things might have more impact if certain sentences were a little less disconnected. So I'm going to make a few suggestions in regards to that. This really was one of the trickiest ones that I critiqued, because a lot of it is working, but there's something just a little disconnected about it. Let me see if I can explain or tweak it somehow. The Marlowe estate had one entrance, just one way into the 25-acre land fenced by the old tall stone walls. One thing I would like to see here is a little more vivid details. A few of these fantasy ones, I really want to see a little more vividness in the description. 25-acre land, old tall stone walls. It just feels like a little blah, and I think that you could find something to tease out a little more, like, ooh, none who served at the king's table had ever been within. Had I no connection to Lady Cho Marlowe, I would sleep deeper at night, knowing my days would not be spent within them. See, I just got a little thrown by none who served at the king's table had ever been within, because I'm not quite sure how it connects. Who serves at the king's table and who is the narrator? It's giving me a little too much to think about. So if we just cut it, how does that feel? In fact, just for the purposes of demonstration, I'm also going to rework this sentence a little bit. The writer is going to have their own idea about what they want to describe. I'm just trying this. This assumes a vibe that may not exist in the book, but I just want to show how you can punch up a description and give it a little more of a feeling. If this was my own book, I would have a better idea of what to put here, because I would know what emotional tone exactly I was trying to evoke. But crumbling stone walls whispering of an earlier era of grandeur hemmed in the vast acreage. Something like this. And here I feel like this sentence is important to establishing the tone, and it could have a little more impact. I would just end this sentence. I would sleep deeper at night. New paragraph. I would be safe, knowing my days would not be spent within them. Something like that gives it a little more of an ominous sense, which I think is what you're going for here. Here you're saying this morning was one of the dreaded ones, and I feel like just by giving it this isolated sentence of like, I would be safe if I wasn't going here, you already have established that this morning brings dread to the narrator. So then you can cut that. Okay, so this morning, Lady Marlowe sent clothes to the narrator's home, a curt summoning, and one I received often. I would kind of say a curt summoning, but one I received often, because when I hear a curt summoning, my first thought is like, uh-oh, this one's especially concerning because she's feeling curt, but then the but kind of shows actually this is her usual way of operating. And this sentence as well, I feel like you could clarify this a little better. Does the narrator prefer the curt summoning because it keeps them beneath Lady Marlowe's attention? And when they say, I never wanted to fall under her wing, is this kind of implying, well, at least this is business as usual. I don't want her to pay enough attention to me that I'm going to live a life among the nobles. I think this is what you're getting at, but it could be a little more clear. And if this is what you're going for, I might rework it something like this. And one I preferred. I never wanted to fall under her close scrutiny, perhaps. I do like the phrase fall under her wing, but still. That's just kind of my quick and dirty way of establishing what I think you're getting at, but I might be wrong. I don't have as much to say about the rest of this selection. It feels a little more clear to me from here. The writing is good. The description of the friend feels like it is worked in pretty organically and that the pacing is working out pretty well, because you're pretty good at integrating like the description of the friend and something that sounds nice, the library that her friend is running or working at, versus the invaders of the country, which implicates that even though they're both kind of surviving, that there is this tense atmosphere, that they've been invaded and are under the control of these other people, which I assume includes Lady Marlowe. In the last paragraph, if she rejects me, Jorlin, how will we survive without her money? The others are growing desperate, and all rumors I hear are of the wall under siege. This is a clear way of setting up the conflict for the rest of the book. It makes sense, and it has a few different layers of interest, so this all works for me. Now this next one, I feel like the dialogue in this one is pretty solid. It reads with a nice flow. It just has one thing that kind of feels amateurish, and that is a lot of dialogue tags. So I would just take a machete to the dialogue tags, which I will show you. All right, so here the dialogue is working fine, but then you have a lot going on here. The shopkeep shook his head, he said with an exasperated sigh, and then he lectured. You don't need 2 dialogue tags in 1 paragraph, so we can just cut that. It's obvious that he's lecturing her. And then we can also hear the hiss here. You think I don't know that? So Liama is trying to get this potion for her aunt. The shopkeep doesn't want to give it to her. Has she tried the support group I told you about? I've been trying to get her to go, but she doesn't listen. But this burning, it's too terrible. She's been seizing on the floor for hours. The situation is pretty sympathetic to the main character. She's got a relative with an addiction, but she also has kind of a legitimate medical complaint, but it sounds like she may have taken the treatment a little too far, and they're probably short on money. Nobody trusts her. Nobody wants to give her this potion. This definitely has some parallels to real life situations. I'm sorry, the shopkeep said. Liama resisted banging a fist on the counter. Fine. Would cut that. We already know who's talking. I hope you can sleep at night with Auntie's death on your conscience. We don't need, she snapped and stormed off, because we already feel that, and she's already leaving. She's huffing, and she's frustrated, she's stomping. We don't need storming and stomping and huffing. And here I would just change Liama had done her signature puppy-eyed plea to Liama had already tried her signature puppy-eyed plea, because we don't see her doing the puppy-eyed plea. We see her getting very upset. So that gives you the sense that she's been around town. She tried it the more endearing way, and now she's just at the end of her rope. Those are about my only tweaks for this one. I feel like it establishes a situation pretty well. It could maybe use more pizzazz, but for page 1, it works for me. This one I just have a few small line edit suggestions, but my main potential concern with it is that the first page ends with blood. It kind of has that vibe of the author felt like they just had to throw in something exciting on the first page, and blood isn't good enough, because that's a very common thing to throw in a first page, just to think, oh, if I add in blood, murder, dead body, war, an assassin barging in the window or something, that will keep people reading. And in fact, it can kind of come off like you're trying a little too hard. But I don't have page 2, so I don't know if this is going to be funny on page 2, or if it's going to unfold and oh my gosh, wow, I did not see that coming with the blood, or, you know, I don't know where it's going. But just based on that first page, the blood better be doing something interesting, I guess is what I'm saying. I, Ava Flynn, was going to die of a heart attack at age 23 is how our first main paragraph opens. This is getting a little close to the book that opens with the character looking in the mirror to consider how their appearance is for me. Like, you're gonna have a blurb so you would know that her name was Ava Flynn. I don't think you have to get the name in right away. Or the age. If you really want to note that she's young, you could just say, I was going to die young of a heart attack. But having both the full name and exact age right there, it just feels a little awkward. So she's having a panic attack in the shower. The writing is solid. I can relate to this. I'm an easily panicked person myself, so I don't have much to say with that. But then when we get to this descriptive paragraph, she looks outside to try to calm her nerves. The landscape always looked gorgeous as kind of just filler. I would cut that and say, on sunny winter days, the landscape was blanketed in clean white sparkles, like whipped vanilla frosting dusted with sugar. We can figure that she's finding this gorgeous without being told. And then as she's looking at the landscape, everything was as it should be, except that's a good way to have a beat there. I really like a good beat. Near the woods, something red caught my eye. I gasped. Was that blood? I don't love the gasp. The gasp is a little much for me. And then I don't know where page 2 is going. And this sample, I know this one comes from one of my Patreons because I've already given some feedback on the synopsis, and I kind of know where they are with the book, which is, if I'm not mistaken, trying to figure out like how they want the plot to go in a way that feels good to them and hopefully interesting to other people. And I feel like when you are at that stage where you're just kind of trying to figure out what way you want the plot to go, I don't necessarily want to get too hung up on like line editing and little details. But since they sent it to me for the video, the main thing that I notice is that there's a fair amount of passive voice, so I'm going to get in there and line edit out the passive voice. And I don't even always hate passive voice. You just want to use it sparingly. I always have to go into my manuscripts when I'm done with them and edit out the passive voice. All right, so this one I want to clean up some passive voice here. There was a thundering of hooves. Just say, a thundering of hooves signaled the arrival of strangers to the town of Little Vale. The bustle of the market was interrupted. Also passive voice. You can just say, the 4 horses charged up the main street, interrupting the bustle of the market. People, I don't feel like is the most vivid word. Maybe shoppers rushed apart. You know, you could even have a little bit of a description there. Ladies with their baskets and apron-clad merchants, you know, whatever, rushed apart so as to not get bowled over by the party, pulling their children and elderly mothers out of harm's way. Some spat on the ground as the men passed. Others scoffed or shouted. I just tweaked that for clarity rather than they, because we have some and the Anyway, I'm not sure that's entirely clear without. Could change the strange men to the strangers, since I changed that to the men already to avoid repetition. The strangers, dressed all in black, dismounted from their snorting horses. We don't need seemingly, like you can tell, unfazed by the unrest that had stirred in their wake. Just as the man who looked to be the leader. These are really common things to do. I still catch myself doing them. The sense that like you need to exactly state like, well, we're not entirely sure if he's the leader, but he looks to be. If he's the leader, you can just say the leader. But I'm still guilty of doing things like that myself. Threw his reins at the stable boy's feet and snickered as the trembling lad scrambled to pick them up. Witch hunters, muttered the girl. Trouble. There's something about this sentence, I don't know. I don't know if I can explain it. If somehow the witch hunters muttered the girl feels a little pat. Like, would you really mutter it aloud if you were in danger with people coming in? Could she just think it? I think the girl is the main character, so you could just have her name. I mean, I'm not sure why to be coy and say the girl if she's the main character, but I don't know, you know, that could be a stylistic choice. And just like everybody knew magic was outlawed. If everybody knows it, then you can just say magic was outlawed. These hunters, she had seen their kind before. They would come to harass women. I don't think we need the come. because we kind of know that they're coming. Maybe you don't even need these hunters because we were already talking about them, so we don't need to kind of reestablish who we're talking about. They would drink in the alehouse, draining what little stock the small town alemaster had, and when it was time to pay, they'd wave their weapons with a sickening grin, and drunken they would harass anyone. You already had harass here. I feel like we get the harassment part already. Like, they're waving weapons with a sickening grin. That definitely feels harassing. But they didn't head to the alehouse. I kind of want, like, this time they didn't head to the alehouse to kind of hit on, oh, they're doing something different. That could be trouble. Instead, the man who looked to be the leader, once again, we'll just say the leader, made his way to the wooden stage at the crossroads and hoisted himself up. The man called out for attention, but most people were already looking his way, glaring at him. The muttering died down, and it became ghostly quiet in seconds. I feel like you'd have more impact if you said the muttering died down, new paragraph, it became ghostly quiet. I would probably, if it were me, also put in like a little bit of a thought or a little emotional state here, just to bring us, we're pretty detached from your main character so far. It almost feels like there is no main character and that this is almost omniscient, which maybe that's what you're going for, but it is not a common choice these days. Plus, I know the synopsis of the story, and it didn't really feel like it was going to be omniscient to me. So that would be my suggestion, is to insert some kind of character feeling, like names, you know, chest clenched. This time it felt different. I mean, this is a little cliche. I'm just kind of giving you a sense of, you know, how you can bring us into the feelings of the main character a little more. She could see him fully now. His black clothes were of a leather coat and trousers and a cotton shirt. He had a thick leather belt with a burnished bronze buckle, which he toyed with one hand, allowing him to lean back slightly with his full height. I could probably make this a little more active. Something like the only spot of color in his black leathers was a burnished bronze buckle, which he toyed with. This is one of those awkward sentences where you kind of want, he toyed with one hand, but then you don't want two withs together. I'm not really sure what the point of the leaning back slightly description is. I'm not sure if it adds anything. Maybe he stroked with one hand. He acted like a tall man, but he was most likely average height. She's looking at him, right? So, I mean, I guess he stood up on a thing, but still. In fact, yeah, we could just cut that because you demonstrate his height by just pointing out that his associates look no smaller. All the strange men wore the same foul facial expression that spoke of arrogance and aggression. I don't know if you need this part either. I think the arrogance and aggression comes across. Okay, so those are my suggestions with that. I'm sorry that I threw a lot at this one. There was a lot of somewhat complicated nitpicks, but generally this writing does have very nice flow to it. It just is yet another one of many that just could use some tightening up in the line edits to give it easier pacing. And now we come to the last sample. I wanted to know as well that I chose these samples using a random number generator because the thought of trying to come up with a criteria to choose them personally was just too painful. I couldn't do it. There were so many nice notes, so many interesting stories, so many hopes and dreams. It was just too much pressure, so I just used a random number generator. Don't read anything into me choosing or not choosing your story because there is nothing to read into it. Now we come to the last story, and it's interesting because this one was just what the random number generator chose for the last story. There was no planning involved. But this story, to me, did actually provide me with that intriguing element, something that was different that I hadn't seen, that was enough that as I was reading it, I found myself not really noticing when it needed a line edit, unless it was just like a flat out typo, which it has a few. But this was kind of a nice note to end on because there are a few things in here that were rather delightful, both in description and dialogue. And this book seems like it's meant to be kind of quirky and funny, so it's probably a little easier to spot, oh, well, yeah, of course you can put unique elements in like something that's supposed to be comedic, but it's actually pretty hard, no matter what your genre, to strike that perfect balance between something unique but something that's not too quirky, too off the wall, alienates the reader base, And, you know, I'm not probably quite the audience for this, so I still don't know if it would connect with readers, but I do know that as I was reading it, I actually did kind of want the second page. So kudos to this author, but I'm still going to get in there and kind of show you what I mean and tweak a couple little things. Okay, so this one seems to be kind of a stoner urban fantasy, which is kind of a fun concept. The writing has good flow. There's some good little humor here. I do have a few nitpicks. Of course I have a few nitpicks. What would I be if I didn't have a few nitpicks? Okay, so I'm going to fix a little typo there. I looked across the empty, dilapidated room down into the cast iron pot I used as a brazier. I'm not quite sure how you can look across an entire room and then down into a pot. I think you'd have to go to the pot. Burning herbs gave off a nice smell, canceling out the mildewy abandoned house odor that usually filled my squat. The sage was almost gone, and I wouldn't be able to buy more until I got paid. Sure, I could get some store-bought stuff, but it wouldn't be nearly as powerful. That was the real McCoy. I think it should be this was the real McCoy, because they have a little bit left still, so it would be this, not that. Just like here, my watch did the little doorbell sound it makes when I got a text. I think it should be got a text to preserve the same tense. And then we get a familiar. Curtis the Genet scurried across the floor and looked up at me. If you took a white cat with cheetah spots, squished it into the rough shape of a weasel and gave it, again tense, preserve the past tense voice if that's what you're using, and gave it a thick white and black ringtail, you'd have yourself a Genet. His feline eyes looked up at me as he scoffed. I guess you're just going to ignore that text. We don't need, he said, because he'd already kind of scoffed to establish that he's the one speaking. And I would probably do, and why not? After all, you ignore my hunger pains all the time. Well, that's relatable. I'm sure my cats are looking at me like, yeah, I like Curtis already. And Curtis is a rather sassy familiar. I do like a sassy familiar if I'm going to be reading an urban fantasy where you expect some humor, you expect the characters to be a little larger than life, and this book is delivering on that. I feel like both the character and Curtis already have a voice. There's some nice little touches of humor, and there's like a vibe going on here, so I don't really have a whole lot to say about this except good job. Okay, so that was the first batch of critique and line edits. Hopefully this video does well and I can keep doing this as like an ongoing series, because I actually had a pretty good time looking at everyone's writing and just puzzling out what I could suggest to make it stronger. But again, if these suggestions don't feel right to you, a lot of this is pretty basic writing advice, but even so, there were times in my life when I was a beginner and I just wasn't really ready to be at that stage of like hardcoreness with my writing, so I'm not someone who's really going to judge you if you don't take my suggestions. Not that I would know unless you updated me, but a few of you asked if I would just offer a first page critiquing service or even a full manuscript critiquing service, and the answer is yes and no. So I did decide I'm going to open up this month. I'm just going to do 5 slots, and I have no idea if there will be interest, but I'm going to open up 5 slots on Patreon for a first page critique. It will be a little more in depth than what I'm doing here because I'm trying to not have this video be 1,000 hours long, but I'm going to do 5 slots critiquing first pages. If you're interested, I can send you the critique either as a video or a email, whatever you prefer. I'm just going to try it and see how that works with my schedule. And it's Patreon, so you know, you want to sign up for just 1 month, obviously, unless you want to pay another $25 for me to read page 2, which I wouldn't recommend because you're going to get the most out of the page 1 critique. As for full manuscripts, I feel like my strength as an editor is really in line editing and in just very broad, is this idea marketable and stuff like that. I don't really feel like I'm great at solving plot problems, figuring out like kind of all the puzzle pieces of like what makes a middle of a book sag and things like that. I just know that I can do it with my own work because I know it really well and I can really ponder the characters, but as a editor for someone else, I don't feel like it's my strength. I think that you'll be better served hiring someone else, and so I would probably never offer a full manuscript critique. I also think that it's a pretty big job, and I have my own books to write, and it would probably drain like my mental powers to write my own books if I was doing full manuscript critique. So I'm only doing first pages. It's $25 for a 1-page critique, and while you're at it, you'll also get the other benefits of my Patreon. So if you're already a Patreon, it's really only like $20 additional. And buying the critiques will also definitely help to support the channel and me continuing to make videos, particularly this type of video, because if I sell all 5 critiques, then I'll know that these videos are worth continuing, if nothing else, as just a funnel to a critique service, which wasn't even something I really planned to do, but you never know where life's going to take you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that some of this information was helpful to you. And do be sure, even if only as a free member, to sign up for my Substack and Patreon so that you don't miss the next call for submissions for future videos. And remember to check out Magic Mind with my code in the description. And if you're a paid Patreon and you sent me a submission and I missed it, shoot me a line. I'll make sure that you are in the next video. Or if I don't do any more videos, I'll make sure that I get you a private critique. I tried to go through them and make sure I had all my paid Patreons and Substack people, but I could have missed someone. I will see you next time. Bye! Betsy? Betsy, can I have this spot?